And we're back. Episode 2 of the CLINK. Now we left off at this image in the first episode. And just to rehash a real quick item. Once again, this is for creating distance between the perpetrator and the police or those working inside the CLINK, because they regarded a lot of their perpetrators as potentially dangerous, carrying daggers, knives, so on and so forth. I might mention that in English society today, they still have an ongoing stabbing problem for the criminal justice and public health authorities. Whereas in the United States, we grapple with gun control. English society has very tight controls over firearms. In fact, even the police do not carry weapons apart from batons, with the exception of very specialized armed units. But back to the knifing problem. This is from time to time, it's an epidemic with a rash of stabbings in London and elsewhere. But in any event, so knives and these sorts of objects on display speak to English society. So let's move on. We have a contraption right here. Stocks and pillories. Stocks and pillories. Now, these items are very important in the history of incarceration and punishment because they add to the element of the public spectacle, putting perpetrators, prisoners on display for purposes of sending a semiotic message. Now that's a big word. Semiotics is the study of signs, something we're going to talk a lot about this semester. Sending messages, and stocks and pillories very much add to this larger conversation about punishment. One of the things that I write about in the book is what I call the museum effect. And the museum effect is a combination of three components: objects, images, and space. Not outer space, but rather inner space. We're looking inside a dungeon. It has its own unique space. And let's see how this object, which is on display, figures into the dialogue on punishment. Text is part of the museum effect. The pillory. For minor offenses such as selling rotten meat, people would be placed in the pillory. Although this seems like a very light form of punishment, many died through starvation by being hit by stones. They're on public display. They're fair game. A person might also have their ears nailed to the wood. It is recorded in local history that between 1319 and 1320, the Bishop of Winchester erected in his manor a furk, which is a deep pit, gallows, cooking stool, the pillory, the tews, which is the pillory for women, for the sum of 14 shillings. Records show that the rotating pillory was installed upon Suffolk Street. Such devices were designed to house up to 4 criminals at the same time. When items were thrown at the criminals, they would normally run to avoid being struck. The attempted avoidance of such items resulted in the forcibly dragging around of the others of the pillory. So it could be a bit comical. And this was to the amusement of local people who, again, saw some of these perpetrators, some of these prisoners as fair game. The museum effect. We got more. And here we have another item on display. The cat o' nine tails. Now, one of the reasons why they refer to this as the cat of nine tails is that it leaves cat scratch scars on the back of the prisoner. And the cat o' nine tails are famous for the use of onboard Navy ships, where the saying, "not having enough room to swing a cat," originates due to the confinement below the decks. The example in front of you is from the Brixton prison, which is South London. Cat o' nine tails would normally be used in conjunction with a prison sentence, along with hard labor. Cat o' nine tails was abolished in the British judicial system in 1948. But similar punishment were used in Trinidad and Tobago until 2005. And that is not ancient history. A lot of these instruments of punishment and torture were distributed through colonial systems, whether it be British or Spanish or French or Portuguese or Dutch. And many of these items that were introduced under a colonial administration oftentimes persisted over the course of many, many historical periods. More about that later. Objects on display. Now here we're back to the performance of the institution. These are storytelling institutions. They use objects and images, and in this case, mannequins, to tell a story, to try to reenact what it's like to be punished. As you can see, there's added elements of punitive evidence. Here we see what appears to be broken eggs, other things that appear to have been thrown at the perpetrator who's on display. And this is an early form of stress and duress, and that is putting prisoners in awkward postures for long periods of time. And we're going to talk about that later in the semester, because these techniques persist in other campaigns, such as the Global War on Terror. And I'm just foreshadowing that. This is stress and duress in an earlier time. Later we're going to look at stress and duress in more modern times. And here we have, remember this? The brank. And once again, this is a reminder that the ritual of men controlling women in public is an important ritual of gender control, because he's also on display. He's also being humiliated because he is being admonished for not controlling his wife in public. She might be using bad language. She might be complaining in public. The authorities then put the brank on her and require him to follow her around or to lead her around, and so on and so forth. So, once again, these are performances, these are rituals. They speak to the enduring legacy of punishment. Now, this is a common term for restraint, oftentimes referred to as the lashing triangle. You might say, well, it looks like a triangle, it looks like a rectangle to me. Well, geometry is really not, it's not strictly enforced in the history of punishment. Commonly referred to as the lashing triangle, because in many cases this is actually in the form of a triangle, which we're going to see later, but here it's in the form of a rectangle. Bear in mind that there appears to be some padding both here and below. And this is to secure the prisoner tightly against this frame and giving the torturer free rein using the cat of nine tails. So again, another form of restraint. Punishment has not only obvious psychological and emotional components, but also physical components as well. Let's see what else we got here in the clink. Now, let me magnify this. Here we have an illustration of prisoners in the stocks of pillories. You can see the guard off to the side. It appears that this guy has managed to allow one wrist and one foot to be removed from the restraint. You can only surmise, you can only guess that perhaps he paid the guard for a little bit of relief. This guy here, unfortunate bloke, there he is. He's on the floor, obviously in a very uncomfortable position of stress and duress. He's probably being punished for other things. Stress and duress. There you go. Objects on display, the museum effect. You can actually touch these wooden frames to get a sense of how sturdy they are. You might be able to manage to inspect the holes that are carved into this wooden frame. You might even appreciate the craftsmanship. But above all, you're going to observe this as an object and instrument of punishment, of restraint. And here we go. More images, illustrations. Now what you see in front of you is a scenario, a more primitive scenario of a person being boiled. And the text is such that, let me magnify to give you a little bit more view of the narrative. Boiling in oil was legalized by Henry VIII, and we all know the history of Henry VIII. A brutal monarch. The first to suffer was the Bishop of Rochester's cook, who was boiled to death in Smithfield, perhaps for an unsuccessful recipe. The victims would be strapped to a pole and plunged into cauldrons. Alternatively, the executioner could put them in cold oil and bring them to a boil slowly. So there you go. Now, a number of years ago, teaching this semester, I was asking students if they had to pick one form of execution that they would be subjected to. One of my students, let's just call her Mary Ann. I said, Mary Ann, do you have in mind a particular form of execution that if you had to pick for your demise, what it might be? And she paused for a moment, and then she said, well, Professor Welch, I think it would be the boiling thing. And I said, oh my God, Mary Ann, why on earth would you pick boiling? And she says, well, if they put you in the cauldron and the cold water is brought to a boil, there will be a point in temperature when that cold water begins to feel good. And as the temperature rises, it will have the effect of a jacuzzi. And I said, Mary Ann, I don't know how you came up with that, but thank you very much for sharing. So we're going to conclude this episode number 2. We're going to take a pause, get another cup of coffee. Can never have enough of that, I think. And we're going to come back for episode 3. at the CLINK. Cheers.